Noah Kigali is a political commentator, joins us this morning live on Talk TV. Morning to you, Noah.
Morning, Christo. How are you?
Fine, thanks. Thanks for taking the time this morning to talk to us. And interesting, because we've been talking about the pay rises. Merseyrail, when it comes to the rail strikes this morning, they've actually given in, haven't they? And given their staff, 7%?
Yeah, 7.1, I think. Unsurprisingly, it's a pretty big story across all of the newspapers, especially as it's polling day in those two by-elections. And the 7.1% figure is quite high. It's not as high as, the 9% or the 11% that inflation actually could be in real terms. So it's not as high as it could be. So it does seem like a midpoint, but this is going to put a huge amount of pressure now on the government to see whether they can sort out something with RMT, because it's proved compromise can be made, and whether that's in the public interest in the long term is an entirely different discussion, but one that's worth having. But it does, because Merseyrail have now capitulated, this puts so much more pressure on the rest of those strikes, because it now looks like there is a world where they don't have to happen.
But does it? But does it really? Because Merseyrail, this is the issue I have with these strikes. I honestly couldn't give two hoots if you're a private company what you pay your staff. I don't care. Give them a 70% pay rise, give them 100% pay rise. I don't care. Nothing to do with me. Merseyrail haven't taken any subsidies over and above furlough and those sorts of things, but they are essentially a privately run company. So it's different, whereas the other rail firms, rightly or wrongly, whether we think privatisation is right and wrong, and I think there's an argument to be had about whether the privatisation of the railways was one privatisation too far. But we are where we are. We still subsidise those wages that go in the pockets of those people that work for those railways. We don't subsidise Merseyrail. So isn't that a little bit different? And isn't that the point of difference, that we can all say, well, look, fair enough, Merseyrail, but we don't subsidise them?
I absolutely agree, but we're also talking about politics in the news at, 6 o'clock in the morning. Most people don't, and most people, all they're going to see is, oh, they're not striking. That's it. And that's going to then put pressure, I think, it'll put a little bit of pressure on the unions, but it will mostly put more pressure on the government, because most people don't know or care. All they're going to see is train workers getting a pay rise.
But they should care. I really think...
I agree. I fully agree they should care, but they don't.
Because we have subsidised the railways to the point of 16 billion we during COVID. Not one railway worker lost their job. Demand for rail travel is still not where it was. There's 10% down. Some people predict it will never get back to pre-pandemic levels. Here in London, the Underground is 25% down. Now, I can't think of any other industry where, with those numbers, those pressures and those subsidies, there wouldn't be a conversation to say, right, well, maybe we need a restructuring. Maybe we need to look at some of the benefits that you're getting. Maybe we need to look at the amount that there is a pay rise, bearing in mind not one person lost a job during COVID. Whereas in this industry, because they are able to cause such disruption, they hit that button. They hit the sort of apocalyptic button at any moment that they want to, and it just gets so tiresome. There are striking here in London a few weeks ago over a boss that was unkind to a member of staff. They've striked a few years ago here in London because they didn't want to have to work 3 or something weekends out of the year in order to get a night tube going, because they were trying to modernise the network. I remember a few years ago when they went on strike because there was a drunk, one of the drivers or something was found to be as let's just say as merry as a newt in the control room or somewhere, and they said, oh, no, it's his diabetes medication. They all went on strike again.
This is why unions have always kind of amused me, is because they do such a terrible job, even pretending to the public like they're actually in it for the people, as they'd really often like to put it. And that's always been something that's quite amused me. And there's specific issues, obviously, especially in the public sector, with if you capitulate to the RMT, give them exactly what they want. You've got to essentially do that across the rest.
And they're not going to do that. They're not
No.
going to get that. I think that this will just ramble on with stalemate. What we desperately need, and what we don't have, is, and I've said this so much, and people might want to hold on to their cereal bowls and get a crash helmet. We need a Thatcher. We actually need a politician that says, you know what, I'm not just going to let this rumble on. I'm actually going to stand up to them, and I'm going to pass legislation that stops those essential workers, and transport workers are essential workers, being able to strike, because you need, or pass the legislation that they at least promised, which was that there needs to be a minimum service that is run by law.
Yeah, well, I mean, the BBC have suggested as well over, since yesterday, it's being suggested that the government are going to introduce legislation soon into Parliament that allows agency staff to be used, which does seem like a very sensible solution. I know the RMT...
But that will sort out the cleaners and all of that, but the problem is that the unions, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure I'm not, the unions have got certain jobs sewn up that can't be covered by agency staff.
Yeah.
Do you think unions are going to allow agency staff to know how to drive the trains, for instance, and say, when they're, when they're not in a dispute, say, oh, come on, agency staff, we'll train you all up to use these trains in the future. So, whilst I think that will partially solve the problem, what we need is automated trains. I mean, we've got them already. What the driver does is press a button to go and press a button to open the doors, and that's about it.
Yeah.
What we need is automated trains, and then we put conductors on the trains. The conductors don't need to be as skilled as the train drivers, meaning that we can use agency staff for the conductors, get rid of the drivers altogether, and use agency staff for some of the other jobs as well, cleaning and the like.
That's a perfect world.
It is a perfect world, and it's never going to happen because they'll strike again. I mean, I swear to God, Mick Lynch walks out of his probably very, very lovely house, bearing in mind the salary that he's on, and he probably looks up and says, you know what? The sky is the wrong colour blue.
Yeah.
Let's ballot for a strike. Let's ballot for a strike. I'm not happy about it.
Zahawi as well. I think it was the Telegraph that have been leading with this one. Zahawi obviously stoking fears of teachers striking as well. Something that's going to instill fear into every student that has struggled over the past few years over COVID, having to work from home, now just won't be allowed to go to school because the teachers want to get involved in a debt, in an inflation wage spiral and plunge the country into doom. It's something that obviously the government have realised is a wedge issue. And especially on the day of by-elections, it's something that they probably hope, if the Labour's strikes can get people out and voting Tory, I assume is the hope.
Look, by-elections aside, there is something of look, knock the Tories all you like, and I do regularly, this Tory government, because I feel that they're awful, but this Tory government is the worst thing to happen to the Tories for as long as I can remember. However, at least I could say, right, well, they've got a coherent position. I mean, what do Labour think of these strikes today? Because I seem to be getting quite confused. Are they in favour of them? No, they're not in favour of them because they were told not to turn up to the picket lines. Oh, but hang on, no, loads of Labour MPs did turn up to the picket lines. Oh, but hang on, no, Keir Starmer told us that the strike shouldn't be negotiated on. But hang on, then there was a private memo that said he was in favour of them. I've no idea. What do Labour think? What do Labour think?
They're constantly shooting themselves in the back. Or in the foot, as the saying, just over and over and over again. And it is really quite funny to watch. It almost seems as well like Wes Streeting is going to try and mount a leadership challenge, which would also be quite funny and possibly the one thing that saves this government from what's going to be some very, very unpleasant elections if Keir Starmer is still about. There's obviously discontent coming back in quite publicly in the Labour Party, and whilst they've papered over those cracks for a while since Jeremy Corbyn was gone, trying to find this electoral success and do what has traditionally been the Conservative thing of, right, we'll get in power and have these discussions later. And that seems to have disappeared again, which is quite funny to watch. We could end up in this situation where Labour is infighting again for the next the next half decade don't really get anywhere. There's words about split, but they end up just splitting every time.
What a dire
stuff
time.
Like
dire government, dire opposition, dire
been saying that for a decade.
With the economy. What an absolutely diabolical time that we have. Okay, when we come back, we'll talk about a couple of the other stories around. We might talk about witchcraft. Really interesting story on that this morning. And that is all live from the Talk Radio studio. This is Talk TV. Morning to you. It's Christo here on Talk TV. How are you? Thank you very much indeed for your company. With you until 6:30. So another few minutes that we've got with Noah Kigali, who's been looking at some of the big stories in the papers. We're going to leave the strikes and the cost of living. Let's talk about this witchcraft story. I find it really interesting. And it's a bill that is being put through the Scottish Parliament to pardon women who were tortured and executed under the Witchcraft Act.
It's a very, very weird story. So it's come from the SNP, possibly unsurprisingly, and it's something that has come up a couple of times. So on International Women's Day, Nicola Sturgeon actually apologised formally for the witchcraft trials and these torturings and murders. But an SNP MSP, it's quite hard to say, is now trying to get a motion introduced into Parliament that formally pardons all of those women, because she believes it naturally turns into modern day misogyny, and that the reason that there are terrible people in the world, and I think she specifically talks about rape and sexual assault, are because we haven't pardoned witches. It's an odd train of thought, but an interesting one. At least it's
that's a weird, because I do think we should pardon witches. Yeah. Actually, I mean, thinking about it, I mean, it's absolutely absurd, but the reason we should do it is not because I believe that anyone who is a misogynist thinks that witchcraft was the reason why they can be sexist. It's mainly because I think that there are still some slightly misguided people. I think of the awful case. Do you remember the case? You might be too young to remember, but Victoria Columbier, who was this awful story of this young girl who was tortured and killed. It was before Baby P by her family, because they thought she was a witch. And they thought that she had like devilish tendencies and all this stuff. So there are still some cultures, and there are still some people where that is still thought about. And so from that perspective, I would say, well, look, firstly, I would do it because it was right. But also, secondly, if you were going to connect it to how there might be an effect to modern day Britain, that to me would seem like a more coherent train of thought. But the idea that misogyny exists because anyone who was born in the last 30, 40, 50 years thinks, well, I can be sexist towards that woman, or I can stare at her on the underground, which I know we're obsessed with at the moment as well, because of witchcraft laws. I think that's a bit backward, if you ask me.
Yeah, it's an odd one. I think partially it may be because, especially in Scotland, there's been this big discussion about the GRA, the Gender Reform Act, and the SNP's relationship as a party with women and towards women. And this has possibly been seen as some kind of attempt to win them back over. I don't know how much that will work. I don't know how big of a thing this has been in people's minds. But the way that it's talked about isn't just, oh, yeah, it was a bit weird that we did that for hundreds of years ago. It's been talked about as this big, massive win for women. Which to me is slightly odd. I think there's 4,000 people that were tortured and some killed under that bit of legislation. I'm not sure when it was overturned. Actually, it may still be somewhere in law. But it's a long time ago, and I think especially at the moment with the SNP's own troubles with alleged misogyny and worse, this kind of looks a bit out of touch, and it is a little odd. But like you say, it's something that we should probably have done or be doing anyway. It's just the way that it's packaged is is a little odd to me.
Yeah, it does seem a little odd, and it seems like we're gonna try and solve a problem that exists today by solving something that is kind of unrelated, and we'll make ourselves look good about it. Whereas I would have said, look, we still have people who are accused of witchcraft in this day and age, which is patently absurd. That's why one might want to get rid of that. Okay, should we end on a nice story about the National Gallery? What are they doing?
So, yeah, the National Gallery are, for their 200th anniversary, sending around the country lots of bits of art to make it more accessible, which is quite a nice story. Goes in line with the levelling up idea that we should all be kind of buying into, about just making sure that wherever you are in the country, whatever background, you can engage in what makes Britain fantastic. And if that is, going and engaging with culture and art, that is absolutely brilliant. So whether you're, not from London, whether you're from as far north as I am in Scotland, that's incredible. And hopefully we get some stuff up here. But it just means that everybody, especially young people, have the opportunity, hopefully, to be inspired and re-engage with culture, especially over a pretty rough last couple of years where they might have fallen out of touch with, with our history, our culture and art.
No, I mean, I wasn't looking at you doing this. I'm just scrolling through some of them, and it is some of our, they're being described as our national treasures. Monet's The Water Lily Pond, which is, of course, that very famous one as well. I think Van Gogh's Sunflowers.
But they said they've got a plan for that. They've not said what it is. They said they've got a special plan.
I think that's a 13th one as well, because there are 12 that they're sending round.
Yeah.
And then there's another, then they're doing something with this, but I don't know what that is.
No, I think they've said they'll let people know closer to the time, which is quite exciting. Build a little bit of excitement. There's also going to be a virtual gallery as well. So from your homes you'll be able to have a closer look, and I'm not sure what else that you can't see on an image, but anyway, virtual gallery they've said, which will be quite good for people that maybe can't get to a proper art gallery.
Yeah, listen, Noah, good to talk to you. Noah Kagani, who is the political commentator, looking through some of the big stories for us this morning.